She wipes her cheeks of phantom tears. What's on tonight? It's trauma and fear. Gaze into the black mirror with eyes to see. Couldn't be clearer. Oh, oh, we hold these truths, you know. Oh, we've got the proof. Oh, you know the thing. Pour yourself some discernment, my friend. Distractions and traumas. One begins before the other ends. Say no, reject the lies. The truth is imperative. That's why we're reframing the narrative.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of Reframing the Narrative. And this week, Jake and I have both been inspired by recent events in our personal lives relating to the cult of Pharmakeia and how prevalent it is everywhere in our society, everywhere you turn. And I will remind our listeners about the great episode we did with James Roguski entitled Resisting Medical Tyranny, where we talked about how the laws are set up to really reinforce and push a lot of unneeded medical interventions on people through the PrEP Act. And certainly there's a lot of aspects that we talked with him about. But today we're just really observing what's happening in situations where people are going for care or even bringing their loved animals for care. And I can say for me, that's where my exposure started this week, that really kind of reinforced the idea that just everywhere you turn, it's there, and someone's trying to push this pharmakeia on you. And I think a lot of our listeners would sympathize that when you're trying to get an animal taken care of at a vet, a lot of these people are well-meaning and genuinely want to help, but they are indoctrinated by the animal side of Rockefeller medicine, and the first thing they do is try to get your animal on some sort of pharmaceutical or stick it on a needle or even push a supplement, which our readers or listeners may remember some of the work that Agent and Medicine Girl have done on supplements and all the toxic and questionable things that go into that are then sold to the rest of the public as the exact same as a natural product. And it's just so in your face everywhere you turn. So that's really a starting point of this conversation. But before I steal too much airtime, Jake, good to see you as always. And I've teed it up. Why don't you keep us going here and maybe talk a little bit about something that happened in your recent experience as well.
Well, good to see you, PJ, as always, and good to be back on for episode 41, Tom Seaver's number. Got to always throw a little bread and circuses in there. It was really strange. We kind of came up with the topic for this episode, and then we both end up taking our beloved kitties to the vet around the same time. And then also, I believe you also have a beloved human in your life who has gone in for some diagnostics and treatment or whatever the remedy has been prescribed for that. But interesting coincidence, I brought my cat over to this country, America, many years ago. And because of my disbelief in Rockefeller medicine, I never brought him to the vet before. But he developed an issue that for sure needed immediate attention. Otherwise, it wasn't going to get better on its own, and I'll spare the details because it kind of was gross, actually. And one thing that immediately happened to me as I was prepared to call numerous veterinary offices was I was wary of the possibility that they would want him updated on his vaccines. You know, interesting how they use the word his vaccines, not just vaccines in general. Has he gotten his vaccines? So as the receptionist tried to ask one of the staff there a question about whether I could get an appointment. It wasn't music, it wasn't Muzak, it was all a long string of essentially advertorials for different types of injections that we could get for our pets. And it was scare tactics, it was coercion, and it was a menu list, almost like you're ordering out for Uber Eats. Like, what would you like? Would you like a side of poison with that vitamin? And then on the consent form, it actually didn't have an option for no, thank you. I do not want any of these things. And it even said that according to California law, and that's where I'm unfortunately located, if you opt in for treatment, you're obligated to have these injections. But there was one little escape hatch for me and my kitty, and that was I just attested to him being up to date. And then that was end of story. But I feel like I kind of got away with something, and I did sign that consent, and there is a good chance that they would have just scanned his history and looked at it and said, well, he wasn't up to date on his rabies or whatever the animal equivalent of RSV is, or COVID. And they could have said, well, we gave him that and here's the bill for it. So that's just an example from my personal life. And, once you do have some kind of a medical intervention that involves surgery, which is what my kitty had in his case, then they're going to recommend some kind of opioids and pain relief and antibiotics and things like that. So you're already off to the races into the system. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it really telling when we brought our animal in with an eye issue, and I don't recall them actually looking down, going eye to eye, opening his eye, shining a flashlight, anything that you would imagine they would want to do with an eye examination, which was in this case part of the symptoms that led us to bring this animal in. And it was immediately, well, what about this pharmaceutical? What about this pill? What about this supplement? And you just sensed it was really the vet's office was an extension of big pharma or animal pharma in this case. And I'm sitting there going, are you going to look in his eye and make sure there's not anything in there? And it was, oh, he could have caught this virus and we have to boost his immune system with this supplement. And,
But the virus only attacks one eye, right? It's a very specific virus.
Yeah. Well, I've heard it so many times in the so-called truther community, that this idea that if you're really into no virus, that it's just a division tactic, it doesn't really matter. But the truth of the matter is, it does matter if you realize that there's never been proof for viruses, and you go back to the fraud of Pasteur and his insane quote-unquote experiments that have since been passed off on the public, and especially the rabies quack scene. Here in Texas, you cannot be seen at a normal vet clinic without that shot. And that is
Same
something
here.
it's very hard to resist if you want to have your animals seen. And my gosh, that is such quackery when you look back at the so-called rabies experiments. And I made an attempt at a video back in April of this year, kind of looking at some of those experiments, leaning heavily on the work of agent and virology, Mike Stone, and
Virology.
virology, um, and certainly did my best to make that a shorter and more digestible version. But the point of the matter is, Pasteur's work was insane, and no one who's looked into that can logically say that what he did makes sense. However, as we've seen, the writers of his story have already stamped it as official, that there is this thing called rabies, and all animals must be injected with toxic metals and God knows what else to prevent this so-called disease. And so that's where I say, yes, it does matter to understand enough of the argument that there are no viruses, there's no, you know, pathogenic or opportunistic viruses out there just looking to go invade a host. Like that's not really a thing. Now, most people don't care to look into that very deeply to really understand why many of us on the no virus camp feel that way or understand that there is a lot of fraud inherent in that. But we have chosen to really speak about Pharmakeia specifically. Not only is it mentioned in scripture, but it's very true that it's linked to witchcraft and sorcery from way back. And I'll do a tip of the hat to Agent for the work that he did on that subject, specific to the black arts and some of the absolutely cruel animal experiments that went into creating the Pharmakeia, which is the modern day Bible of pharmacy and chemistry related to it. But if you go back to the 1800s, you'll see that there was a lot of needlessly cruel animal experimentation that went along with a lot of the so-called established procedures or remedies. And much of this goes back to even Paracelsus and his work trying to incorporate mercury into many things, part of the alchemic process, thinking that there was this one grand solution that could be used to melt gold or any other substance and take other metals and turn them into gold or silver. It goes into many occultic practices that many people don't realize were there ahead of time. And if you look at modern medicine symbolism, you will also see that a lot of it ties to both occult and Greek myths, such as Hermes. Like you look at the common symbol for medicine and the snakes interwoven. I mean, that symbol goes very much to Hermes and him being the great trickster and one going between different worlds, and basically being a guide of souls. But there's just so much of this literal sorcery that goes into the pharmaceutical world and built it up. And to me, I think it continues to this day, getting people to take things that ultimately poison them and to consent to doing it. But I know I've said a lot there. Jake, I'll let you add a comment.
Sure, appreciate it. I think I'd like to kind of zoom back and take a general perspective at a lot of this and our relation to it being consent. And I think on the level of something like, do viruses exist or not, it's almost the same. In fact, I would argue it is the same as just proving scientifically that carbon dioxide does not cause catastrophic or even anything more than a slight change in temperature. Therefore, it can't even be fingered as the culprit or the root cause of climate change itself. It can affect temperature slightly. And on the same uh, line of thought, viruses have, if you go back into the experiments that you were referencing, and nobody being able to show that a virus exists in nature other than in a petri dish or anything like that, that's all irrelevant because the science, the establishment, takes this as gospel. Speaking of scripture, their scripture is Pasteur. Their scripture is the University of East Anglica and what they say about climate, and the guy at Penn State, Michael Mann. And it doesn't really matter. You can't argue with them about facts on a factual basis. You just don't win because the paradigm is already set. It's really true. The science is settled as long as you buy into the paradigm. And so what we're really getting into is kind of opting into psychically and then one step after the other into a system that has been built around these ideas, whether they're based in reality or not.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
So I just wanted to get that in, that point. It's like you can't win against the entire medical industry by walking into a clinic and saying, well, I'm not going to get a vaccine because viruses don't exist. You just can't win that way.
So true. And I referenced this a week or so ago in our discussion that 4 or 5 years ago, I was getting an annual checkup of some kind, and I was asked if my shots were up to date, and I had said, "Oh, I don't believe in all that. It's a bunch of junk science." And this particular doctor was, "Oh, I read the journals all the time. It's quite good science." And of course, they're not going to push back or question what they've been told, especially because it's quite limited. And as long as what they're reading goes along with the program, then it all matches up and seems right to them. And it's unfortunate, but I think you really touched on a good point, which is if it's official history, it doesn't matter if it makes sense. It doesn't matter if it's true. I don't know if it's in Time Magazine or Newsweek, but the majority of the population believes Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And you have people on both sides of the equation giving their version of that. You've got the controlled opposition, Candace Owens and Ian Carroll, and probably Joe Rogan at this point, all saying, oh, Israel did it, but it definitely happened. And then you've got the other side of the equation. If I had to guess, Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow and all them, and they're all basically saying different flavors of the same thing, and it's official history. Even though those with eyes to see can tell, there's so many holes, literally, in that story, but it is officially written history. There's no way for the average person to go and look and find that it's not official history. And I wasn't planning on doing a shameless plug here, but I will, not only because we've been graciously invited to be part of this project, but I think it is just highlights the importance of what Agent and Medicine Girl are doing with the Shadowban Library, that they are recording real, true history in a place that people can find it. Because how hard has it been for many of us as we've gone through that journey of awakening and discovery to say, well, I don't believe this. Where can I find something that might have contradictory information? And it exists, but it's quite a task to find all of that. And real history will show that the reason we're needlessly injecting people with heavy metals and other foreign substances is largely based on sorcery, on occult practices, on quackery, convincing people that there is some invading species trying to get them, when in fact, when you dig a layer deeper, you see people were poisoning themselves with toxic food, there was toxic water, all sorts of different things out there actually making people ill. But the story was, well, there's this invasive part of nature that's out to destroy, and you must somehow inoculate yourself to survive it. And that's just the effect of his story and its impact.
One thing I'd like to go back to is our episode 27, which was about the words have meaning and the magic of words. And if you go to the root of the word pharmakeia, it's a Greek word that does mean sorcery. And what does sorcery require? It requires a buy-in, right? You think of a magician and a magic act. Well, you kind of have to suspend disbelief and you just say to yourself, I'm in a magic show. Therefore, what does this require of me? It requires me not trying to debunk this guy as he's up here. And you're in a state almost like when we watch anything coming through a screen of suggestibility, and you want to be wowed, you want to be entertained, and you want the magic trick to blow your socks off. And then maybe after that wears off, you go back and you say, oh, wow, I wonder how that was done. And then maybe you can figure it out. But any of these things that we're talking about where the entire establishment treats certain issues in certain ways, goes about addressing what is identified, not necessarily what we identify as an issue, um, is it requires buy-in from us, and it also requires buy-in from the establishment. And the establishment, as we've pointed out many times, like you said with the Charlie Kirk situation, was it doesn't matter if he's dead or alive. It's been established in the official narrative that he was assassinated, and therefore we are going to respond in this certain way. And they do the same thing with Pharmakeia. So it really is a spell at its root, because it requires sorcery. It requires a lot of ritual and word magic and even chemical magic, and the robes that the medical staff wear. It's What's the difference between that and a priest's robe? So it really requires that you suspend disbelief and then you buy into the belief that this is the best system. But it's all based on this premise that has been given to us.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to stress the point of consent that you had highlighted earlier, which is in most cases we have the choice of saying yes or no to some of these so-called remedies, but it does seem in certain circumstances, we brought up the rabies shot as one where the full force of the law is behind the requirement, unless of course you are to find a caretaker, caregiver that will look the other way, which is, I suppose, always an option if you know one, but they're few and far between. In a similar manner, most of us have the option of saying no to shots in our arm, but it was an interesting play by the powers that be back in 2021 to try to force the issue and try to force people to comply and to take an experimental injection. Now they didn't have people door to door trying to kick down doors and inject, but that was always the underlying current, that could be a step they take. It was either the carrot or the stick, and they really chose the carrot. Do you want to go back to normal life? Well, if you do, roll up your sleeve and get with the program. And they really held that out for people to say, do you like being isolated? Do you like wearing face diapers? Do you like all this? Or do you want to go back to this illusionary world that we've built up? And most people said, yeah, I want that back. So it was the carrot, not the stick, but the stick was always ever present.
It was the donut, not the stick. I know.
Or the free burger. Which burger is that? Shake Shack or something? Yeah.
Shake Shack, Krispy Kreme.
Yeah.
I'll choose the burger without the bun, thank you. Getting to the idea of remedies, right? We don't want to just talk about things that there's no solutions for. So I think getting to reaching the consciousness that yes, this is sorcery, there's trickery involved, there may be no actual science behind what we're being presented, and if there is science, it's flawed or it's completely misguided to begin with, or corrupted, or whatever the case. But the remedy is not to, it really comes down to asking yourself, how can I heal myself when this comes to something like your own health? How can I take responsibility for my own health? When you can see that the doctors are pushing supplements and vaccines on you, if you're still in the mindset that you need to buy something or you need to go to someone, you could still end up spending a lot of money on red light therapy or something that is outside what you do in your immediate environment to take care of the toxicity. As you said, a lot of these root causes can be traced to toxicity. And I'll even say that sometimes toxicity takes many forms, and sometimes it's even just like psychic vampires. It's people who are toxic in your life, toxic relationships, toxic thoughts, can come from inside. You can poison yourself with bad thoughts. I was a pretty miserable person and probably pretty toxic back about 20 years ago when I was listening to our friend Alex Jones pretty much every day on bike rides and runs with earphones in, just listening to good old AJ ranting. That was toxic. I didn't manifest in physical ways, but I'm sure, as I've mentioned before, I wasn't too much fun at parties.
Yeah, you bring up a really, really good point there. And so we've talked a lot about things like supplements and straight up pharmaceuticals being toxins and, resisting that in your life and taking personal accountability to with your own habits. But then the people you surround yourself with is equally as important, and that can add to a toxic part of your life. And you just saying that reminded me of a great quote from Chase the Lion, which I've already referenced in a previous episode, but a very good book. And
Tell us the
there was
author
a,
again.
yeah, and one really good line from that I've taken away to always remember if someone is a critic of you is that an insult from a fool should be considered a compliment, and a compliment from a fool should be considered an insult. Really take that to heart and think about who you're allowing to feed into your mind and in your soul, because that is one more type of toxin that most people don't really think about. But the people you surround yourself with ultimately become part of you. And it's really, once again, your choice of who you're letting input into your mind and influence your decisions. And that's ultra important. But I actually want to take this a step further, and it's something that I've been thinking about and reading about recently, just really questioning some of the things that I've done in my past and even recent, which is how are we feeding ourselves? Are we overfeeding ourselves? And there's there's been a lot of discussion online recently in the truth community. I'll give credit recently to just being reminded about it again by the fittest flat earther Tyler. He posted an episode recently about fasting and how important it is that when your body's not always in a constant state of digestion, it actually goes into a state of healing and repairing damaged cells, and that you actually have more regenerative properties when the amount that you're consuming is limited. And it just goes back to one more of the Rockefeller established, I guess, conventional wisdoms, is that you need 3 meals a day. But do you actually need 3 meals a day, or are you keeping yourself in a constant state of digestion and processing where your body could be doing much more and you could be in a better state mentally and spiritually and physically? It's something to consider. And even hopefully a future guest of ours wrote something about water overconsumption. Franklin O'Connor, I highly recommend his post on his Substack. He really got me thinking too about, are we taking in too much water, and are the standard recommendations actually doing us a disservice? It's really something to think about. So again, just thinking about everything around us, we're always being bombarded with a way to create a toxic environment within us. Like you said, taking a step back and considering all of it and making the choice of what do I actually need versus what's being pushed on me.
I really like your point about water. You just mentioned it in passing, but we get down to water as it's called the water of life, and it really is alive itself. And it's been proven by such researchers as Masaru Emoto and other researchers up to the present day with Veda Austin and her fantastic work that I highly recommend, that water can take on consciousness. Now we're filled with water. The earth, whatever the shape of it, is surrounded by, covered with water. And if water can carry consciousness and signals and thoughts, then it's of primary importance to have good water at the very foundation of our health approach. And I think that's something that I look forward to maybe talking with Franklin when we get him on, which I think will be pretty soon. So I'm looking forward to that. But definitely some really thought-provoking work has been done about water and consciousness and getting down to the essence that maybe our entire paradigm, and this goes into the Pharmakeia, is essentially physical based, and as opposed to something that is electrical, and it's positive and negative diodes, so to speak, and charges, and then the consciousness of water being carried through. It's an electrical universe. It can't be contained in a physical space. It can only be carried and conducted and transmitted and transferred. And so maybe the entire paradigm of the chemical and the physical approach to life and to well-being is misguided. And whether that's intentional or not, getting back to one of our earlier episodes, probably about the midway point to where we are now, and satanic germ theory, why did we emphasize the idea of satanic germ theory? Well, Satanism is really a materialistic, at its essence, a materialistic model and approach to a spiritual and conscious world. So maybe the solution to overturning it is to find your way back into that spiritual consciousness, and that could begin with water.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. As I was hearing you talk about that, it really made me think about the not only is the essence of Satanism and many occult practices carried on by high levels of Freemasonry and Jesuits and the quote unquote Illuminati, or the hidden hand, high levels of power and secrecy, they really do focus on this idea of do it thou wilt, popularized by Aleister Crowley. And it really is do it thou wilt in the sense of live this physical, indulgent life and try to fill that spiritual void with everything physical that is a fleeting pleasure at best. And so if you think about that in context to overeating, there we've got this idea now that you've got food on demand, you've got all these food choices, you've got food in your face, and always this encouragement to keep eating, keep drinking, keep consuming, no matter what it is. And it really is part of this overall idea that if you just keep your physical flesh engaged with some sort of distraction or some sort of consumption, that it's going to fulfill your life where it may feel unfulfilled otherwise. And I really like that point that you're bringing up about water and how it carries an essence to it, and it's electric. It communicates. It's part of something much bigger than just quenching thirst. I think that just really speaks to the overall existence and creation that we live in, that we are a connection between the physical, the spiritual, and there's kind of going back to my point about fasting, that there's such a higher level of consciousness that can be attained when your body's not always in this consuming mode, and you can receive. Instead of consuming, you're receiving and then sharing with others. And I think that that's a higher level that we all can attain. And you don't need a pharmaceutical to lose weight. You just need to stop consuming and have balance in your life. And I think that's where a lot of people look for those external solutions. And it's part of that do what thou wilt, consume, 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 and do whatever it takes to consume to your satisfaction.
Really good point about balance and constantly striving to add something, whether it's adding a supplement or whether it's seeing this expert or that expert or getting this or that treatment or buying this or that product. Just look at the people that have the most wealth in the world and how ugly and mean looking they can get, and they just don't look like they have inner glow. They're not satisfied from within. There's something that drives them to just eat. They're Pac-Men. They're the master Pac-Men. And so maybe we should take a little pause and think about what we can subtract rather, and that might be just these urges to go from one physical thing to the next. And when you don't have the urge to reach for something, then you're alone with yourself. You can have some space to think. And we've touched on the idea of the clutter that we have in our lives now. There's so much noise and so many distractions that we are rarely alone with our thoughts in those in between moments where you just suddenly get a thought or inspiration. And maybe these days when you're just trying to fill those moments, whether you're on the sofa, on the toilet, or even like at a red light for F's sake, right? How many people do you see at an intersection or even crossing the street on their phone? Can't they just drive? Can't they just walk? And I'm guilty of that from time to time myself. So my appeal would be allow yourself to be alone with yourself. Allow those thoughts to enter your mind, and then really give yourself some space to assess where you are, what your relation with food is, what your relation with the people in your life, what your relationship is with the people in your life, and are those toxic relationships? So really, just allowing subtraction to take place in your life can go a long way. And I'm encouraging myself at the same time that I'm bringing this up for other people as well.
I do love that idea of addition by subtraction. And I think it's important to think about what you're adding by taking out of your life. And one example that really hit home for me recently, it's one of Jake and I's favorite bread and circus activities going on now currently as this is being recorded, the Major League Baseball playoffs. Think about if you go to a game, what are the first things that you're encouraged to do when you're sitting are? You're immediately given, you've got to go get your beverage of choice, you've got to go get a bunch of snacks.
Here, beer
Um,
here.
immediately get food, immediately get something to drink, an alcoholic beverage, a soda, whatever. You're sitting here, you're participating in this bread and circuses and start consuming. And it's just really telling. And at the end of the day, yes, I've gotten sucked into that because I grew up a baseball fan, but I just had this every now and then I participate in these things and why am I doing this? What did this just gain me in my life? And just really, I think that's an important point, that could we be adding to our life by taking some of these distractions away and some of these overconsumption urges out of our way, that we could be in a better physical state and a better mental state.
It has to come from within, the desire to have a relationship with yourself and with your creator, maybe, if that's important to you. I think that's a missing link for a lot of people, just that spark of life that we have been given, and allowing yourself to be still. That's why meditation is so good. That's why fasting has been so good for so many mystics and seers, because it does allow that stillness and that quiet, and on a physical level in your digestive system and blood circulation, everything going on within the body, it allows for that regeneration, that repair. And so it's very important to rejuvenate and have a practice for that. And as we've been touching on throughout this episode, if it involves pharmakeia, there's a good chance that there's no rejuvenation on a real tangible level taking place if that's what you're going for. So just really, the whole paradigm is a physical paradigm, a chemical paradigm, and a lot of it's based on trickery. And I am fairly confident that our audience is beyond reaching for miracle cures all the time, and they're prepared to hear some discussion about some issues that require accountability. We want to reach beyond the conspiracy theory realm of people just talking about shit or just arguing, literally arguing about things that they only saw through a screen. And we would be much more gratified if what we discuss here is it translated into tangible, real action in people's lives and made a difference in their lives and the lives that they touch as well.
Really good points. And it made me think too about, you mentioned trickery and pharmakeia. Pharmakeia at its core, beyond its roots of sorcery and witchcraft and all that, it is tricking your body in some way. It's suppressing something. And it really should cause people pause to take a step back and say, if you understand the body is meant to heal itself, what are you really doing when you're turning something off in your body, and what are you sacrificing? And I saw a perfect example of that earlier today in a discussion with a colleague who mentioned that this person was on GLP-1 for weight loss, and I'm sure I've heard other people losing weight through this pharmaceutical, but at what cost? Do people really know what they're doing to their body? And is that weight loss really, is that juice worth the squeeze, is my question. Because what ultimately are you doing to your body's biochemistry, and who knows, your organs? The pharmaceutical industry is going to rubber stamp anything, and the FDA is part of the pharmaceutical industry. So let's not even talk about quote unquote regulation, but they're going to rubber stamp anything that looks like a big blockbuster. And the
Yeah.
studies will be quick, rushed, and missing many important pieces of information. And so I think my point here is just, what are you doing to your body when you're shutting something off, a natural response for healing? And even more so, I think it's really important to think about everyday products that we use and what those are doing to our bodies with endocrine disruptors and things of that nature. That's just one more way of disrupting our body's normal chemistry and flow that, again, most of us don't give consideration to, but it's equally as important. Just thinking about all the toxic things around us, it's literally everywhere. And certainly you have to pick your battles. You can't be anti everything, but you can make wise decisions and discern on what perhaps could be a better alternative than something that disrupts or outright turns off your body's normal defenses.
You can't fool Mother Nature. And so a shortcut like GLP-1 is going to have some kind of knock-on effect where the body is not achieving the results that was desired through the right means, and therefore something's got to give. And I'll just point one more thing about, since you mentioned GLP-1, notice how it was made to seem out of reach. It was only for the rich. It's $1,000 a month. And now, boom, competition for it. FDA approved, as you mentioned. Price is coming down. You see advertisements for as low as $49 a month or something like that. I don't even know the exact amount, but like we mentioned before with AZT, people clamoring for the solution, right? They're given the problem and then they're going, give me the solution. I need this remedy. Oh yeah, we've got it for you. It's only $49 a month, GLP-1, instead of watching what goes down your gullet or exercising or whatever means that are more natural and more sustainable. So yeah, good points there about that. And what are your final thoughts here to wrap up?
I think it's probably a call to action to just really question anything that's being pushed on you as an external solution. And I apologize for sounding repetitive because I feel like we've said that before, but I think it's an important point. And I do believe not only in human bodies, but as we started the conversation, in our animals' bodies, the same creator made those animals as well, and they have the equal ability to heal themselves. And I don't think it's toxic heavy metals or pharmaceuticals or God knows what in supplements that are going to make them better. It's just getting them in a better environment to clean the fish tank and not vaccinate the fish. If our listeners know that that analogy, but certainly I think it's really just using discernment on what you're putting into your body or your loved ones or loved animals' bodies.
Amen to that. And just one final thought, that when a lot of people have observed how animals that become sick respond, fasting is very, very common among animals, and they'll even give themselves enemas. They'll, like, birds will give themselves enemas. So yeah, learn from nature and be part of nature. Try to be in touch with it, whether it's going for a walk or whatever you need to do, row a boat, splash yourself, do something. So that's my call to action this week. Get in touch with yourself, creator, and the creation itself.
And get in touch with us at Reframing the Narrative at protonmail.com. Come join this conversation. We've had people from every walk of life, and we certainly love new perspectives. But with that, Jake, good conversation as always. And to our listeners, tune in next week. We have a very exciting guest lined up and many more to come, we sure hope. But we appreciate your time and paying your attention to us. We'll see you next week.